Rosalind Franklin was born on July 25, 1920. She grew up in a Jewish family in pre-World War II London. She was known for being a clever and outspoken girl within her family. Her family would send her to St. Paul's Girls' School, a well-known private school that focused heavily on academics. Two school friends of hers would say when inquired about her, she was the best in science, best at maths, best at everything. She expected that if she understood to do something, she would be in charge of it. Despite objections from Rosalind's father, who believed she would become a social worker, Rosalind decided she wanted to become a scientist. In 1938, Rosalind would graduate from Newnham College at Cambridge. After graduating, she would take up a job at the British Coal Utilisation Research Association. Rosalind, determined to aid in the war effort, would publish many research papers on structure and uses of coal and graphite. The work in these papers would be used in the creation of the gas mask. It was because of this work that in 1945, Rosalind would earn a PhD in physical chemistry from Cambridge University. In 1947, Rosalind would move to Paris and take up a job at the Laboratoire Central, aiding Jacques Mering on creating the science of X-rays. Rosalind enjoyed working in Paris. She easily earned the respect of her colleagues, and she enjoyed doing all the difficult mathematical equations that came with her job. In 1951, she decided she needed to move back to London to help advance her career in science. After returning to London, she would begin working at King's College. Despite having to work with older equipment in the basement of the building, she would quickly take charge of her lab. Even though she had to leave the building every day for lunch due to women not being allowed in the building's cafeteria, she still continued to make progress in the study of DNA. When Maurice Wilkins, another scientist at this lab, returned from his vacation, he was dismayed to learn the assistant, who he expected would work for him, was instead an incredible scientist. Rosalind would continue her research into X-ray images under the tense environment, beginning to fear she had made a mistake by leaving Paris. Wilkins, who was also uncomfortable in this environment, began to research more in a different lab with a friend of his, Francis Crick. Crick and his lab partner Watson had been in the process of discovering the structure of DNA molecules. It was around this time that Rosalind and her partner, Raymond Gosling, discovered the two forms of DNA from their X-ray images. Rosalind and Gosling would discover an A form that appeared to be drier and a B form that appeared to be wetter. The pair decided that the A form would yield better photos, so they labeled the photo Photo 51 and set the B form aside to study later. Rosalind around this time would attend a conference where Watson and Crick would present a DNA model. Rosalind was critical of Watson and Crick's model because she felt they had based their model on their opinions rather than set facts and data. Rosalind's criticism towards Wilkins' friends would only lead to a more strained relationship between Rosalind and her colleagues. The people at her lab would grow to dislike her so much they would begin calling her the Dark Lady behind her back. In 1953, Rosalind decided to escape her toxic work environment and move to Berwick. During Rosalind's move, Wilkins would find some of Rosalind's notes containing Photo 51. Wilkins would take the photo without Rosalind's permission or knowledge and showed it to his friends. Photo 51 was all that was needed for Watson and Crick to prove what DNA looked like. Watson and Crick hurried to publish their findings in their scientific journals. While this was happening, Rosalind had moved back to Berwick, and as a part of her agreement, she wasn't allowed to research more into DNA, so she began researching viruses. Over the next several years, she would make monumental discoveries about tobacco mosaic virus and also polio. On April 16, 1958, Rosalind Franklin would die of ovarian cancer, most likely caused by her exposure to radiation from her work. In 1962, Watson, Crick, and Wilkins would be awarded the Nobel Prize for their work in the DNA field. Rosalind's work would barely be mentioned when the award was given, and when Double Helix was written by Watson in 1968, Rosalind was depicted as the bad guy. He would go as far as to describe her as a belligerent, emotional woman, unable to interpret her own data. Rosalind's contributions to science were only acknowledged in the last few decades. Mary Anning was born sometime in 1799 in Lyme Regis, Dorset, England. The Annings family had around 9 or 10 children, only 2 of which would live long enough to reach adulthood, Mary and her older brother Joseph. Richard Anning was a cabinet maker and an amateur fossil collector. Mary would begin helping Richard with his fossil collecting, starting from around the time she was 5 or 6. Richard would teach his daughter how to properly find and clean fossils, and then he would later sell them in his shop. Like many other women in this time, Mary would have very little education. She knew how to read, but that was around where her formal education ended. She would, however, teach herself anatomy and geology. In 1810, Richard Anning would die suddenly from a mixture of tuberculosis and previously acquired injuries. Mary's brother Joseph would become an apprentice upholsterer, and Molly, Mary's mother, would begin to encourage Mary to sell some of her fossils to help pay off some of the family's debts. During the Napoleonic War, people were encouraged to start vacationing near their homes. This led to people flocking towards towns near the ocean. It was also around this time that finding fossils began to gain traction as an interesting hobby. Around 1811, Joseph Annings would find an interesting-looking fossilized skull. Joseph would inform a then 12-year-old Mary, who would then spend the next several months carefully digging the outline of the skeleton. By the time she was done, everyone in town knew what she had discovered. At first, scientists thought it was a crocodile. Many people at this time thought that any creature they did not recognize were animals that had migrated to a different place. At this time, the concept of extinction had just been introduced. Several years after the fossil was found, it was eventually named the Ichthyosaurus, or the fish lizard. Today we know that it was actually a marine reptile that lived around 200 million years ago. In 1823, Mary would be the first to discover a full skeleton of the Plesiosaurus. As the news of this find spread, rumors began to circulate that it was fake. George Cuvier, also known as the father of paleontology, would even dispute this find. It wasn't until a meeting at the Geological Society of London that Mary wasn't invited to that he would finally admit he was mistaken. Even though Mary had a good reputation for finding and identifying fossils, the men who bought the fossils she sold in her shop would refuse to credit her in their research papers. Even when they wrote about the Ichthyosaurus fossil that Mary had found, they wouldn't credit her. This was made worse when the Geological Society of London refused to admit Mary into their organization because she was a woman. It wasn't until 1904 that the GSL would even admit a woman into their group. In 1828, Mary would uncover the first remains of a Dimodorphin, the first Thesaurus, known as a pterodactyl, to be found outside of Germany. Mary was also one of the biggest contributors to the science of coprolites, or fossilized species. Mary would continue to find fossils and sell them in her shop. A childhood friend of Mary's, Henry de la Batte, taking inspiration from Mary's discoveries, would create the painting A More Ancient Dorset in 1830. Henry would begin to sell prints of this painting as a way to help raise money for Mary, who was still struggling to make enough money to make ends meet. In 1847, Mary Anning would die at the age of 47 years old from breast cancer. Despite all the discoveries Mary made, she would still die unknown, uncredited, and still struggling to make ends meet.